more than two. And that's part of why you see President Trump, when he goes to the Hill to rally lawmakers, not saying, these are my red lines, this is my drop dead. He's saying, pass it, and then we'll get to it. And during the break, the early reporting I saw from our team at Bloomberg, who has been there covering that this morning, is that to say that Roy Moore was not part of the discussion. There was another small victory lap on Asia, shocking, some discussion of the basketball players.
Yes, but he walked through on his role in getting the UCLA players back to the U.S.
But then in terms of drawing lines in the sand about this is what I like in the House bill, this is what I like in the Senate bill, that is not what today is about. And in fact, what he's trying to do is rally them to the next phase by saying, if we get this done, we can go on and begin to tackle entitlement reform, welfare reform, something that's popular.
Well, you see on the screen, Trump said to House Republicans, the Senate will come around on taxes. Let's talk about that. So the House is going to vote today on what I just talked about. The Senate is, as it tends to be, a different beast. And the issue there is that you have one Republican, Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, already saying, no, I can't support this. Now, whether or not he's gettable, it depends on whether they can make changes. But there's a list of many others who are not no's and not yeses. John McCain, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, Rand Paul, Ted Cruz. Okay, we don't have that up there, but I would tell you it's a long list.
Langford is on there.
James Langford. Yeah. It's a long list. Now, some of these guys, there it is. There you see their faces. Some of these senators are, playing for leverage, which is a smart move. It's legislating 101. But, since the Republican leadership only have 2 votes to play with, meaning they can lose 2, and then a third means that this thing is not going to happen, it's kind of dangerous.
Well, Susan Collins, I think, is a really interesting case here. As I've said before, she wants to vote for a tax bill, but including the health care mandate repeal in there complicated that for her. Corker and Flake, we know about them too. Who knows where they're going to come down on this? Senator McCain has been opposing these big efforts here. Johnson, we all watched him negotiate on the floor during the health care vote, right up to the last second, and then
he seems more gettable than the rest of the pack, particularly when you tied the health care in with it, right?
And this is all part of the dispute over Roy Moore, too. That election's on December 12th. Can you get the votes in time? I think it's an open question in the Senate. I was actually a little more confident a few weeks ago that they could pull this off, and now I look at it and go, well,
and it's obviously worth repeating. We've been talking about this for several days now, but the critical difference and the change this week was adding the repeal of the individual mandate, throwing Obamacare into the mix. Senator John McCain, one of those who is not a yes, not a no, said the following, I just picked up the newspaper today and they've made a huge change. Every day there seems to be. No, it's not regular order, he said. I have no idea, but I'm insisting on regular order. And that's why he helped.
That sounds like a guy trying to buy a room.
You maybe, but look, he helped sink the other 2 efforts.
I'm saying that he had been fairly. It looked like he would back it, and now he's raising the regular order, which is his rationale.
How can you even imagine a world, just politically, purely politically here, where Republicans fail to do this in addition to Obamacare? I mean, I have not talked to one Republican who has not been desperate and fatalistic about getting tax reform done, just to say to the voters, look, you can put us in charge and we can get something done, as opposed to we got nothing.
If the Republicans head into 2018 saying they've got nothing, it would not shock me at all. They have not been able to advance the ball on any issue for several years. They've had the majority in both chambers over there. And with this president, their lack of progress on health care gives me no confidence they can get the tax reform done. And to a point that Carl was making earlier, the last time a big, juicy tax bill got passed 20-some years ago, Gallup showed it was almost 2 of every 3 Americans said that their tax bills were too high. That number now is right around 50%. It's still a lot, but it's not the groundswell that it was back in the 80s. And I'm just not sure that some of these senators feel the need to push a tax cut through just for the sake of having a victory.
Very quickly, too.
Yeah, I think that is the conundrum that Republicans find themselves in. They've convinced themselves, not with some merit, that they need to pass something. But what if they pass something? Then they've got to run on it in 2018. That's a big problem that I don't think Republicans have quite figured out. They're running a sort of Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell agenda with Donald Trump, except Donald Trump's at 38%, 37% approval rating. That's not a very good, necessarily popular agenda to run on.
We're going to take a quick break, but it's also dangerous to run on the biggest tax cut in history. That's how the president is telling the House Republicans to market it behind closed doors today.
If you don't get one.
If you don't get one.
That's right. Or if your tax bill goes up.
Yeah, even worse. All right. Stand by. We do have live pictures on Capitol Hill. We're waiting for the president to leave the U.S. Capitol, head down Pennsylvania Avenue, back to the White House after his meetings. We'll be right back.